Sheriff Jack Strain of St. Tammany Parish spent decades protecting children from predators while secretly raping minors himself, receiving 4 life sentences plus 25 years for aggravated rape of children who trusted him as their community's top law enforcement officer. But this ultimate betrayal of public trust was enabled by the very badge and authority that parents believed would keep their children safe from monsters like him. Jack Strain had built his reputation as a tough-on-crime sheriff in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, where he presented himself as a dedicated public servant committed to protecting families and children from the criminals who threatened their safety. Strain had served as sheriff for years, earning the trust and respect of parents who believed he was their community's guardian against predators and violent criminals. Strain appeared to be everything a community wanted in their top law enforcement official, a strong leader who took crime seriously and worked tirelessly to protect the innocent from those who would harm them. His public persona was that of a family man and protector who understood the importance of keeping children safe from the dangers that lurked in society. But while Strain was wearing the sheriff's badge and carrying the public trust of thousands of families, he was systematically sexually abusing minors who had no reason to suspect that their community's top law enforcement officer was the very predator they needed protection from. His crimes represented the ultimate violation of the sacred trust between law enforcement and the vulnerable populations they swear to protect. Strain used his position as sheriff to access and exploit vulnerable children, leveraging his authority and the respect that came with his badge to commit horrific crimes against minors. While parents trusted him to protect their children from predators, Strain was using his law enforcement credentials to become the predator that families feared most. The investigation into Strain's crimes revealed a pattern of systematic child sexual abuse that had been occurring while he served as the parish's highest law enforcement official. Federal and state investigators worked to expose the full scope of his criminal activity and the ways he had exploited his position to access victims. Strain's victims were children who had been traumatized by the very official who was sworn to protect them from exactly the type of violence he was inflicting upon them. The psychological damage extended beyond the physical abuse, to include the devastating realization that their community's protector had become their predator. The legal consequences for Strain's crimes were severe, with courts recognizing the extreme nature of his betrayal of public trust. He received 4 life sentences plus 25 years in state prison, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to exploit his authority to harm children. The St. Tammany Parish community was devastated by the revelation that their trusted sheriff had been committing the very crimes he was elected to prevent, creating a crisis of confidence in law enforcement that would take years to rebuild. Strain's case exposed how a sheriff's position could be weaponized to access and exploit the most vulnerable members of society, proving that the badge could become a tool for predators rather than protection. Welcome to Savage Case Files. Today we're exposing America's most corrupt sheriffs, whose heinous crimes shattered the trust between law enforcement and the communities they swore to protect, revealing how the badge became a license for criminal activity rather than a symbol of justice and public service. Case 2. Victor Hill. Victor Hill was the sheriff of Clayton County, Georgia, who built his reputation as a tough-on-crime law enforcement leader while secretly using restraint chairs as torture devices against detainees in his custody, violating their federal civil rights and proving that his badge had become a license for systematic abuse rather than protection. Hill had positioned himself as a no-nonsense sheriff who would bring order to Clayton County through aggressive law enforcement tactics. Hill had served as Clayton County Sheriff with a history of controversial methods that he claimed were necessary to maintain public safety and control criminal behavior in his jurisdiction. His supporters viewed him as a strong leader who wasn't afraid to use whatever tactics were necessary to keep the community safe from criminals and troublemakers. Hill presented himself as a sheriff who would hold criminals accountable and ensure that those who broke the law would face serious consequences for their actions. His public image was that of a law enforcement official who understood that tough situations required tough responses to maintain order and protect law-abiding citizens. But while Hill was claiming to serve justice and protect his community, he was systematically torturing detainees by strapping them into restraint chairs without any legal justification for such extreme measures. His use of restraint chairs went far beyond any legitimate law enforcement purpose and crossed into deliberate infliction of suffering on people in his custody. Hill targeted detainees who had no recourse against his authority and no way to defend themselves from his abuse while they were confined in his jail facilities. The restraint chairs became instruments of torture that Hill used to inflict pain and suffering on prisoners who were completely helpless against his power. The federal investigation into Hill's practices revealed that he had been systematically violating the civil rights of detainees through his unauthorized and excessive use of restraint chairs. His actions constituted torture under federal law and represented a clear abuse of his authority as sheriff. Hill's victims were people who had been placed in his custody and who trusted that they would be treated according to legal standards while detained in his facilities. Instead, they experienced torture at the hands of the very official who was supposed to ensure their constitutional rights were protected. The federal prosecution of Hill focused on his deliberate violation of detainees' civil rights through his use of restraint chairs as torture devices. The evidence showed that his actions were not justified by any legitimate law enforcement purpose and constituted systematic abuse of his authority. Hill was convicted of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, while also being removed from his position as sheriff. His conviction established that even elected sheriffs could be held accountable for torturing people in their custody. The Clayton County community was forced to confront the reality that their sheriff had been using his authority to torture detainees rather than protect their rights, exposing how law enforcement power could be weaponized against the very people it was supposed to serve. Case 3. Lawrence Hodge. Lawrence Hodge was the sheriff of Whitley County, Kentucky, who ran his office like an organized crime family, using his badge and authority to operate a long-running criminal enterprise that included public corruption, extortion, drug trafficking, and theft that turned the sheriff's department into the largest criminal organization in the county. Hodge had served as sheriff in the rural Appalachian community where residents trusted him to fight crime and protect their families from the drug dealers and criminals that plagued their region. Hodge appeared to be a dedicated rural sheriff who understood the unique challenges facing mountain communities, where poverty and isolation created opportunities for criminal activity that required strong law enforcement leadership. His supporters believed he was working tirelessly to protect their community from the drug trafficking and violence that threatened their way of life. Hodge presented himself as a sheriff who would take whatever steps were necessary to combat the criminal elements that were destroying rural Kentucky communities through drug trafficking and related violence. His public persona was that of a tough mountain sheriff who wasn't afraid to confront the criminals who were bringing drugs and violence to his county. But while residents believed Hodge was fighting crime and protecting their community, he was actually running the largest criminal operation in Whitley County, using his sheriff's office as headquarters for multiple illegal enterprises that included extortion, drug trafficking protection, and systematic theft from the very taxpayers who had elected him to serve them. Hodge's criminal enterprise involved extorting local businesses and protecting drug dealers in exchange for payments that enriched him personally while allowing criminal activity to flourish under his protection. His badge became a tool for criminal extortion rather than law enforcement, as he demanded payments from businesses and individuals who had no choice but to comply with his demands. The federal investigation into Hodge's activities revealed the extensive scope of his criminal network and the ways he had corrupted the sheriff's office to serve his personal criminal interests rather than public safety. His case exposed how rural sheriffs could operate with minimal oversight while building criminal empires. Hodge's victims included the honest businesses he extorted, the community members who suffered from the drug trafficking he protected, and the taxpayers whose trust and money he stole while claiming to serve their interests. His crimes represented a complete betrayal of his oath of office and his duty to protect the community. The federal prosecution of Hodge resulted in his conviction on multiple charges related to his criminal enterprise, including corruption, extortion, and drug trafficking. Protection's evidence showed that he had transformed the sheriff's office into a criminal organization that served his personal interests rather than public safety. Hodge was sentenced to 15.5 years in federal prison for running his criminal enterprise from the sheriff's office, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to exploit his law enforcement authority for criminal purposes. The Whitley County community was devastated to learn that their trusted sheriff had been the leader of the very criminal organization they had expected him to fight, creating a crisis of confidence in rural law enforcement that would take years to overcome. Case 4. Guadalupe Lupe Trevino. Guadalupe Lupe Trevino was the sheriff of Hidalgo County, Texas, who served on the Mexican border while secretly laundering money for drug cartels and accepting proceeds from the very criminal organizations he was supposed to be fighting as part of America's war on drugs. Trevino had positioned himself as a Hispanic law enforcement leader who understood the unique challenges of border security and the fight against cartel violence that threatened both sides of the Rio Grande. Trevino had built his reputation as a border sheriff who was committed to protecting his community from the drug trafficking and violence that plagued the Texas-Mexico border region. His supporters viewed him as a strong leader who could navigate the complex challenges of border law enforcement while serving the predominantly Hispanic population of Hidalgo County. Trevino presented himself as a sheriff who was dedicated to fighting the drug cartels that were bringing violence and corruption to the border region, claiming to understand the importance of stopping the flow of drugs and cartel money that was destroying communities on both sides of the international boundary. But while Trevino was publicly claiming to protect the border from cartel influence and fight the drug trafficking that threatened his community, he was secretly accepting drug proceeds and laundering cartel money through his position as sheriff. His badge became a tool for facilitating cartel operations rather than stopping them. Trevino's criminal activity involved accepting payments tied to cartel drug operations and using his position as sheriff to facilitate money laundering schemes that helped cartels move their illegal proceeds through legitimate financial channels. His corruption directly enabled the very criminal organizations he was sworn to combat. The federal investigation into Trevino's activities revealed his connections to cartel money laundering operations and his acceptance of drug proceeds while serving as the county's top law enforcement official. His case exposed how cartel corruption could reach the highest levels of American border law enforcement. Trevino's betrayal affected not only his immediate community, but also national security, as his corruption compromised border security efforts and enabled cartel operations to continue with the protection of a corrupt American sheriff. His crimes represented a direct threat to the integrity of border law enforcement. The federal prosecution of Trevino focused on his money laundering activities and his acceptance of drug proceeds from cartel operations. The evidence showed that he had used his position as sheriff to facilitate criminal activity rather than prevent it. Trevino was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for his money laundering crimes, though many believed his sentence was insufficient given the national security implications of his corruption and his betrayal of the border communities that trusted him to protect them from cartel influence. The Hidalgo County community and the broader border region were forced to confront the reality that their sheriff had been working for the very cartels they feared, exposing how drug money could corrupt even the highest levels of American law enforcement along the Mexican border. Case 5. Mike Corona. Mike Corona was the sheriff coroner of Orange County, California, who used his position in one of America's wealthiest counties to build a corruption network while harboring political ambitions that would be destroyed by his criminal activity and witness tampering conviction. Corona had served as the top law enforcement official in Orange County, where his high-profile position gave him access to wealthy donors, political connections, and opportunities for personal advancement. Corona had built his reputation as a prominent sheriff in Orange County, one of California's most affluent and politically influential regions, where he projected an image of clean law enforcement leadership while building relationships with powerful business leaders and political figures who could advance his career ambitions. Corona presented himself as a modern law enforcement leader who could effectively manage the complex challenges of policing in a wealthy, diverse county while maintaining the political relationships necessary to secure resources and support for his department's operations and his own political future. But while Corona was projecting an image of integrity and professional law enforcement leadership, he was actually running corruption schemes from his office and using his position to benefit personally from his relationships with contractors, donors, and political allies who expected favorable treatment in exchange for their support. Corona's criminal activity centered on his efforts to obstruct justice by tampering with witnesses who could expose the broader corruption network that federal investigators were working to uncover. His witness tampering represented a direct attack on the judicial process and the rule of law that he was sworn to uphold. The federal investigation into Corona's activities revealed his involvement in corruption schemes and his attempts to intimidate witnesses who could provide evidence about his criminal network. His case exposed how political ambition and personal greed could corrupt even high-profile sheriffs in wealthy counties. Corona's witness tampering affected the integrity of the federal investigation and threatened the safety of individuals who were cooperating with law enforcement to expose corruption in Orange County government. His actions represented a direct assault on the justice system he was supposed to serve. The federal prosecution of Corona focused on his witness tampering activities, though prosecutors had alleged broader bribery and corruption charges that the jury ultimately rejected. His conviction on witness tampering alone was sufficient to destroy his career and political ambitions. Corona was sentenced to 66 months in federal prison for his witness tampering conviction, ending his career in law enforcement and his political aspirations, while exposing the corruption that could exist, even in America's wealthiest counties. The Orange County community was shocked to learn that their high-profile sheriff had been involved in corruption schemes and witness tampering, proving that wealth and political prominence could not prevent the kind of criminal behavior that destroyed public trust in law enforcement leadership. Case 6. Ken Jenney. Ken Jenney was the sheriff of Broward County, Florida, who had transitioned from politics into law enforcement leadership while secretly engaging in federal mail fraud and tax evasion through undisclosed payments and benefits that violated his oath of office and federal law. Jenney had served in Florida politics before becoming sheriff, bringing political experience that he claimed would help him modernize and improve law enforcement operations in one of Florida's largest counties. Jen had built his reputation as a politically savvy law enforcement leader who understood how to navigate the complex relationships between law enforcement, local government, and the business community in Broward County. His supporters believed his political background would help him secure resources and support for the sheriff's department while maintaining effective law enforcement operations. Jenna presented himself as a sheriff who could bridge the gap between traditional law enforcement and modern political realities, using his experience in government to build partnerships and secure funding that would benefit both his department and the community he served. But while Jenna was claiming to serve the public interest and modernize law enforcement operations, he was secretly accepting illegal payments and benefits that he failed to report to federal tax authorities, violating both his oath of office and federal laws governing public officials and tax obligations. Jenna's criminal activity involved accepting undisclosed payments and benefits while serving as sheriff, then engaging in mail fraud and tax evasion to conceal these illegal financial arrangements from federal authorities who were responsible for monitoring the financial activities of public officials. The federal investigation into Jenna's financial activities revealed his pattern of accepting illegal payments while failing to report them properly to tax authorities, exposing how his political connections had been used for personal financial gain rather than public service. Jenna's crimes affected the integrity of the sheriff's office and violated the trust of Broward County residents, who expected their sheriff to operate according to legal and ethical standards rather than using his position for personal financial benefit. The federal prosecution of Jenna resulted in his conviction on mail fraud and tax evasion charges related to his acceptance of undisclosed payments and his failure to report them properly to federal tax authorities. Jen was sentenced to 366 days in federal prison for his financial crimes, though many believed his sentence was relatively light given his violation of public trust and his abuse of his position as sheriff for personal financial gain. The Broward County community added Jenna's case to Florida's growing reputation for political corruption, as residents were forced to confront another example of how their elected officials had used public positions for personal financial benefit rather than genuine public service. Case 7. Patrick Sullivan, Jr. Patrick Sullivan, Jr. was the former sheriff of Arapahoe County, Colorado, who continued his criminal behavior after leaving office by possessing methamphetamine and offering drugs for sex while working as a security official, proving that his corruption extended far beyond his time wearing the badge. Sullivan had served as sheriff in Colorado before transitioning to private security work, where he believed his law enforcement background would provide credibility and opportunities in the private sector. Sullivan had built his reputation as a Colorado sheriff who understood the challenges of law enforcement in a rapidly changing state, where population growth and evolving drug problems required experienced leadership to maintain public safety and community trust in law enforcement operations. Sullivan presented himself as a former law enforcement professional who could apply his sheriff's experience to private security work, claiming to understand the importance of maintaining high standards and ethical behavior even after leaving his elected position as a public servant. But while Sullivan was working in private security and trading on his former reputation as a sheriff, he was actually engaging in drug criminal activity that included methamphetamine possession and using drugs to exploit vulnerable individuals for sexual purposes, representing an extreme breach of the public trust he had once held. Sullivan's criminal activity involved possessing methamphetamine and offering drugs to vulnerable individuals in exchange for sexual favors, using his access to illegal substances to exploit people who were struggling with addiction and dependency issues that made them easy targets for his predatory behavior. The investigation into Sullivan's post-sheriff criminal activity revealed his involvement in drug possession and his exploitation of vulnerable individuals through drug-for-sex arrangements that violated both drug laws and represented a form of sexual exploitation enabled by his access to illegal substances. Sullivan's crimes affected vulnerable individuals who were struggling with addiction and who became victims of his exploitation, while also damaging the reputation of law enforcement professionals who were trying to maintain public trust and credibility in their work. The prosecution of Sullivan resulted in his conviction on methamphetamine possession charges and related offenses connected to his exploitation of vulnerable individuals through drug-for-sex arrangements that represented a complete abandonment of the ethical standards expected of former law enforcement officials. Sullivan was sentenced to 38 days in jail plus probation for his drug crimes, though many believed his sentence was insufficient given the extreme breach of public trust represented by a former sheriff engaging in drug dealing and sexual exploitation. The Arapahoe County community and the broader law enforcement profession were shocked by Sullivan's post-sheriff criminal behavior, which proved that corruption could continue even after corrupt officials left their positions of public trust and authority. Case 8. Robert Arnold. Robert Arnold was the sheriff of Rutherford County, Tennessee, who exploited prisoners and their families through illegal kickback schemes involving jail kiosks and e-cigarettes, using his control over the county jail system to generate personal profits from the captive population under his authority. Arnold had served as sheriff in Tennessee, where he was responsible for operating the county jail and ensuring that prisoners were treated according to legal standards while serving their sentences. Arnold had built his reputation as a Tennessee sheriff who understood the challenges of managing county jail operations, where overcrowding and limited resources required creative solutions to maintain security and provide basic services to the incarcerated population under his supervision. Arnold presented himself as a sheriff who was working to modernize jail operations and provide services that would benefit both prisoners and their families, claiming to understand the importance of maintaining communication and commerce systems that could help inmates maintain connections with the outside world. But while Arnold was claiming to improve jail services and modernize operations, he was actually running illegal kickback schemes that exploited prisoners and their families by taking personal profits from jail kiosk operations and e-cigarette sales that were supposed to benefit the inmates rather than enrich the sheriff. Arnold's criminal enterprise involved honest services fraud, wire fraud, and extortion through his manipulation of jail contracts and services that generated illegal kickbacks for his personal benefit, while prisoners and their families paid inflated prices for basic communication and commerce services. The federal investigation into Arnold's jail operations revealed his systematic exploitation of the captive prisoner population and their families, who had no choice but to pay whatever prices he demanded for basic services, like phone calls, commissary items, and other necessities. Arnold's crimes affected hundreds of prisoners and their families, who were forced to pay inflated prices for basic services, while Arnold pocketed illegal kickbacks from the companies that provided these services under his corrupt contracts and arrangements. The federal prosecution of Arnold focused on his fraud and extortion schemes that exploited the captive prisoner population for his personal financial gain, proving that he had violated his oath of office and federal laws governing public corruption. Arnold was sentenced to 50 months in federal prison for his jail kickback schemes, ensuring that he would experience incarceration from the perspective of a prisoner rather than the corrupt sheriff who had exploited inmates for personal profit. The Rutherford County community was outraged to learn that their sheriff had been exploiting prisoners and their families through illegal kickback schemes, proving that even the most vulnerable populations could become victims of sheriff corruption and greed. Case 9. Pat Kelly. Pat Kelly was the sheriff of Rio Arriba County, New Mexico, who accepted bribes and engaged in extortion while protecting drug dealers from prosecution, using his badge and authority to enable the very drug trafficking operations he was supposed to be fighting in rural northern New Mexico. Kelly had served as sheriff in a region known for its drug trafficking problems, where residents expected strong law enforcement leadership to combat the criminal organizations that were bringing violence and addiction to their communities. Kelly had built his reputation as a rural New Mexico sheriff who understood the unique challenges of fighting drug trafficking in remote areas where limited resources and vast territories made law enforcement difficult, requiring dedicated leadership to protect communities from criminal organizations. Kelly presented himself as a sheriff who was committed to fighting the drug dealers and criminal organizations that were destroying rural New Mexico communities through trafficking operations that brought violence, addiction, and corruption to areas that lacked the resources to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. But while Kelly was claiming to fight drug trafficking and protect his community from criminal organizations, he was actually accepting bribes from drug dealers and using his position as sheriff to protect their operations from law enforcement investigation and prosecution. Kelly's criminal activity involved extortion and bribery schemes, where he accepted payments from drug dealers in exchange for protecting their trafficking operations, warning them about pending investigations, and ensuring that they could continue their criminal activity without interference from his sheriff's department. The federal investigation into Kelly's activities revealed his systematic protection of drug trafficking operations and his acceptance of bribes from the very criminals he was supposed to be arresting and prosecuting for their crimes against the community. Kelly's crimes enabled drug trafficking operations to flourish in Rio Arriba County, while residents suffered from the violence, addiction, and community destruction that resulted from his protection of criminal organizations that should have been his primary targets. The federal prosecution of Kelly resulted in his conviction on extortion and bribery charges related to his protection of drug dealers and his acceptance of illegal payments from criminal organizations operating in his jurisdiction. Kelly was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for his drug protection schemes, ensuring that he would serve significant time for his betrayal of the community that had trusted him to fight the very criminals he was actually protecting. The Rio Arriba County community was devastated to learn that their sheriff had been protecting the drug dealers who were destroying their families and neighborhoods, proving that corruption could enable the very criminal activity that rural communities feared most. Case 10. Jack Spratt. Jack Spratt was the sheriff of Breathitt County, Kentucky, during the notorious Bloody Breathitt era, when he ran corruption schemes and protection rackets while maintaining ties to violent crime that earned the Appalachian County its deadly reputation. Spratt had served as sheriff during a period when Breathitt County was plagued by feuding families, political violence, and criminal activity that made it one of the most dangerous places in Kentucky. Spratt had operated as sheriff during an era when Breathitt County was known for its violent feuds and political corruption, where law enforcement officials were often connected to the very criminal organizations and family conflicts that were destroying the community through ongoing violence and intimidation. Spratt presented himself as a sheriff who could navigate the complex family loyalties and political relationships that defined Breathitt County politics, claiming to understand the unique challenges of maintaining order in a region where traditional law enforcement approaches had failed to control violence. But while Spratt was supposed to be bringing law and order to Breathitt County, he was actually running corruption schemes and protection rackets that enabled violent crime to continue, while he profited from the very criminal activity that was terrorizing residents and earning the county its bloody reputation. Spratt's criminal enterprise involved providing protection to violent criminals and criminal organizations in exchange for payments, while using his position as sheriff to shield criminal activity from investigation and prosecution by state and federal authorities who were trying to bring order to the region. The federal investigation into Spratt's activities revealed his connections to violent crime and his operation of protection rackets that enabled criminal organizations to continue their activities without fear of law enforcement interference from the sheriff's department. Spratt's crimes contributed to the violence and lawlessness that defined the Bloody Breathitt era, as his protection of criminal organizations allowed violent feuds and criminal activity to flourish under the shield of corrupt law enforcement leadership. The federal prosecution of Spratt resulted in his conviction on corruption charges related to his protection rackets and his ties to violent criminal organizations that had been terrorizing Breathitt County residents for years. Spratt was sentenced to multiple years in federal prison for his corruption and protection schemes, though his conviction came too late to prevent the violence and criminal activity that had flourished under his corrupt leadership. The Breathitt County community's experience with Spratt became part of the historical legacy of Appalachian corruption and violence, proving that corrupt sheriffs could enable the very criminal activity that destroyed communities and earned regions their reputations for lawlessness. These 10 corrupt sheriffs reveal disturbing patterns that expose how America's highest county law enforcement officials transformed their badges into licenses for criminal activity, exploiting their ultimate authority to commit the very crimes they were elected to prevent, while hiding behind the trust and respect that communities placed in their positions. The common themes across these cases show how sheriffs exploited their unique position as the highest elected law enforcement officials in their counties, using their authority over jails, investigations, and personnel to create criminal enterprises that operated with minimal oversight from state or federal authorities, who struggled to investigate corruption at the sheriff level. Geographic patterns emerge from rural counties, border regions, and politically corrupt areas where sheriffs could operate with limited scrutiny from media, oversight agencies, or competing law enforcement organizations that might expose their criminal activity. Kentucky, Texas, Florida, and other states with histories of political corruption produced multiple corrupt sheriffs who exploited weak oversight systems. Crime categories ranged from the most heinous personal crimes like child sexual abuse and torture to systematic corruption involving drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, and protection rackets that transformed sheriff's offices into criminal headquarters rather than law enforcement agencies dedicated to public safety and community protection. Victim demographics included the most vulnerable populations in American society: children who trusted law enforcement to protect them, prisoners who had no recourse against sheriff authority, community members who depended on honest law enforcement, and businesses that were extorted by the very officials who were supposed to protect them from criminal activity. Authority exploitation showed how sheriffs used their control over jails, investigations, personnel, and evidence to commit crimes while protecting themselves from prosecution, intimidating witnesses, and maintaining their criminal enterprises through the very law enforcement powers that were supposed to serve justice and community safety. Investigation challenges revealed the difficulty of prosecuting the highest law enforcement officials in their counties, as federal agencies were often required to investigate and prosecute cases that local and state authorities were unable or unwilling to pursue due to political connections, intimidation, or corruption within local government systems. Federal intervention became necessary in most cases because local and state authorities lacked the independence, resources, or political will to investigate and prosecute corrupt sheriffs who had used their positions to intimidate potential witnesses, corrupt local officials, and protect their criminal enterprises from local law enforcement scrutiny. Community impact extended far beyond the immediate victims, to include the complete destruction of public trust in law enforcement, the enabling of criminal activity that flourished under corrupt protection, and the psychological trauma of discovering that their protectors had become their predators and exploiters. Legal consequences ranged from relatively light sentences for some financial crimes to multiple life sentences for the most serious offenses, with federal courts recognizing that corruption by sheriffs represented a fundamental threat to the rule of law and the safety of the communities they were supposed to serve and protect. Share your thoughts on how these sheriffs were able to operate criminal enterprises from their offices while maintaining the trust of their communities. Which case do you think could have been prevented through better oversight and accountability mechanisms? This has been Savage Case Files. Subscribe to enjoy more engaging American true crime stories like never told anywhere else.